troubleshoot any further, but I think things have gone out and I have no idea what might have caused that. So
we'll fix it for the next time, but yes, let's go ahead and we'll be recording the meeting. So if anybody misses it, they'll be able to see it on our website.
Good. Okay, great. So let me start by first again welcoming all of you, and especially Robert, who's with us. And I would like to I'll read a little bit. I'm going to read an introduction for him so you know a little bit about his background, which you may have seen and perhaps you read, but if not, this is a bit about Robert. Robert's both a colleague and a good friend of mine, and he is the founder and director of the Applied Compassion Academy and the Applied Compassion Training Program, which is offered in collaboration with the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research. It's called CCARE at Stanford University. ACT is a groundbreaking 11-month global program that's founded on and incorporates the pillars and principles of applied compassion, and it supports individual participants in the development and then execution of a public-facing offering that responds to the challenges of today's world. So people have taken all different kinds of projects on, and disaster shock is an example of the project that I used for my capstone project. Robert trained at Stanford Medical School of Medicine in the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. He's a Stanford lecturer, an instructor, and teaches at Stanford University, UCSF, Kaiser Permanente, and other multiple venues, teaching compassion cultivation training. He was ordained in Burma under the renowned meditation master, the Venerable Pa Auk Sadao, and studied with him from 2003 to 2012. In addition to his teaching, Robert does grief counseling and facilitates retreats for fathers grieving the death of a child, and he also sits on the board of directors of the Sati Center for Buddhist Studies. So that is a little bit about Robert, and he is familiar with disaster shock, as he's been a mentor to me through this project. So I'm going to turn it over to Robert.
So great. Thank you, Sue. Thank you for that nice long introduction. And yes. I also want to just comment on all of the people who are on this call and have been involved with disaster shock. You really responded well to this mini disaster this morning. So if you got the original email, the topic that I wanted to talk about is mindfulness in the service of compassion, or awakening compassion as a response to COVID-19. And I want to, before I begin, I want to get you on gallery view so I can see everybody. So it's a pleasure for me to be here with all of you and to have this opportunity to share a little bit about a subject that's near and dear to me. And when I was invited to give this talk to you this morning, it honestly took me a while to decide how I wanted to talk about mindfulness and compassion, and really more specifically about awakening compassion as a response to COVID, to the worldwide COVID-19 pandemic. So in the process, I reflected on the wonderful book that so many of you worked on, and about the excellent exercises and resources you included to support and help people navigate their way through the aftermath of all sorts of disasters, whether they're big or small. And I know that the book concentrated on things that we would normally label a disaster. So seeing the evolution of your website and how wonderfully robust and useful it is, I really do want to start by taking this moment right now to give a shout out to everyone who worked on disaster shock, to Brian and to my dear friend Sue, and to each of you to I know that your individual contributions have made a real difference. Disaster shock is what it is because of your collaboration, your shared intention, and your collective efforts. So kudos to all of you. You've really produced something wonderful, and it's a gift to the world. But you might be wondering, what does mindfulness and compassion have to do with any of that? Especially since cultivating these qualities requires a regular ongoing practice. It's akin to learning a skill, like learning a new language or learning a musical instrument. So as I thought about this talk, I saw my challenge being about how to conceptualize the practices of mindfulness and compassion, even the practice of equanimity, into a suite of
My phone.
skillful responses to the never-ending flow. And I want to emphasize this, the never-ending flow, because I'm going to come back to this over and over again this morning, of changing conditions that trigger and challenge all of us day in and day out, and that are only exacerbated by the uncertainty and the social isolation that's been imposed on us and has fractured our normal interactions with one another during this very disorienting time. So once again, I'd like to begin my talk here with asking a rhetorical question or two. What exactly is mindfulness? And what does mindfulness have to do with compassion? For that matter, what is compassion? And what does it or mindfulness have to do with responding to disasters? So a couple of very simple definitions here in order to give you a clear sense of what I mean by mindfulness and compassion, and also the context in which I'm using these terms here this morning. So as Sue mentioned, I spent quite a number of years practicing meditation with one of the great living meditation masters on the planet today. And I came away from that training sort of realizing that mindfulness is multi-layered. And so for the purposes of this talk, I want to talk about mindfulness as a quality, a non-judgmental, mirror-like quality of the mind that reflects what's being known, simply the object of the meditation. I see this phone, I identify it as a phone. I know that this is a phone, okay? So this is one quality. It's you. Now Siri is answering me. All right, sorry about that. So this non-judgmental mirror-like quality. So when you stand in front of a mirror, the mirror does what? It reflects the image that's in front of it. It doesn't judge the image as good or bad, right or wrong. It simply reflects the image. So it's the knowing of that, of what's being reflected. Another way to think of mindfulness is the moment-to-moment continuity of awareness that can attend to what is being known. So now I know that I'm speaking, and now I know that I'm moving my hand, and now I know that I'm feeling the warmth from the heat being on in this cottage this morning. So these are qualities. So you know, you maintain your attention from moment to moment to moment on what is being known. And then a third way that's a little bit deeper and might not be so important in terms of, or so relevant in terms of the talk I'm giving this morning, but the the continuity of awareness on a single object, such as the breath. If you were trying to practice meditation, you might be given an object to focus your attention on. This is a quality of mindfulness, being able to stay with the object. And when the mind moves away, you simply recognize that the mind has moved away and you return to the object of the meditation.
Oh, my professor, let me call you back. My professor's talking. Bye.
So, so this is a simple definition of mindfulness. And compassion, I'm going to offer a 4-part social science definition of compassion, just to help to frame it here. So compassion would contain 4 elements here. It would contain first, cognitive recognition that there's distress or suffering happening in yourself or in another person. Certainly, this is something that you all recognize when you're responding to disasters. And then it contains an emotional response to that suffering. So these 2 qualities of cognitive recognition of suffering and an emotional affective response to suffering, those two steps in this definition of compassion, those 2 are empathy. But that's where empathy stops. When the movement to the intention to alleviate or mitigate that suffering arises, then we've moved into the realm of compassion. So we have this cognitive response to suffering. We have an emotional affective feeling in response to our cognitive recognition. And then we have the intention to alleviate or mitigate that suffering. And then the 4th is what you're all doing, and that is the motivation to action to alleviate the suffering. So how do you respond, to disasters, literally? So the work that you are all doing is a perfect example of applied compassion, bringing these heart qualities into fruition and offering them to the world. And I realize that there are people in this Zoom session who are familiar with mindfulness and may even be experienced mindfulness practitioners, and that many of you are already familiar with the benefits of meditation. But I'm going to ask that you hang in there with me. So in the midst of disasters, am I really suggesting that people sit down and meditate? And I guess I would answer that by saying it depends on the nature of the disaster. So I'd like to share a brief overview of an interesting study that was done a few years ago. I think it was done at the University of Wisconsin here in the US, and that included several thousand participants. And the study was investigating the topic of neuroplasticity and how engaging in mindfulness practice changes our brains, our emotional lives, and our overall sense of well-being. And the scientific paper upon which the study was based, I believe was titled "The Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." And when I put this talk together, I came upon some notes. So I wish that I could give you who was the lead on that. I think it was Richard Davidson out at the University of Wisconsin. So I want to credit him with the study. So the study asked participants 3 questions. And the first question was, what are you doing right now? The second is, where is your mind right now? Is it focused on what you're doing, or is it focused elsewhere? And the third question is, at this very moment, how happy or unhappy are you? So those are the three questions. What are you doing right now? Where is your mind right now? Is it focused on what you're doing, or is it focused elsewhere? Are you thinking about what you're going to do later today? Are you thinking about last week? And at this very moment, do you know if you're happy or unhappy? Interesting questions. So here's what the study found. Found that there are 4 challenges facing society today, which are significant failures of well-being. And these 4 challenges are distractibility, loneliness, negative self-talk, the inner critic or the judge, and the loss of meaning and purpose in life. So I'll go through these briefly. So distractibility, we found that there's a growing attention deficit disorder on the societal level. We've become a society of sound bites, a culture of sound bites and mind-numbing news cycles and ever more dazzling technologies that enthralls us and simultaneously dulls our human sensitivities. It distracts us. We're distracted. It's marvelous, but it's seductive, and we get distracted by it. The average American adult, I'm sure that Americans aren't all that different from people in other parts of the world, but the average American adult spends 47% of their time not paying attention to what they're doing. And when we're not paying attention to what we're doing, studies show that we're significantly less happy. Loneliness. Recent research shows that loneliness is actually a predictor by more than a 2-fold magnitude of early mortality compared to things like obesity. Here again, a statistic from America, 76% of middle-aged Americans report that they suffer from high levels of loneliness. I found that shocking. 76% report that they suffer from high levels of loneliness. The third point that I want to talk to is this issue of negative self-talk, the inner critic or the inner judge, or one of my colleagues in the program I teach at Stanford calls it the inner Supreme Court of judges, the voice that tells us we're not good enough, we're not smart enough, we're not well equipped enough, we don't know how to do this, we don't know. The voice that tells us we're inadequate and helpless. So this voice leads us down the rabbit hole of depression, and depression is on the rise in our country. And here's another fact or statistic that I found shocking, that it's on the rise, particularly among women. And apparently in the previous 3 years to when the study was done, there was a 33% increase in diagnoses of major depression in women and young girls. And suicide in America is also on the rise, with at least 1 teenage suicide per day. That's hard to take in, but that seems to be the case. And then this fourth challenge is the challenge of the loss of meaning and purpose in life. And this it's a predictor of early death. People in their 60s with low purpose in life are over 2 times as likely to die within 5 years of those with high levels of purpose. So that's on the side of the challenge. The study also found, or at least suggested, that there are 4 pillars of a healthy mind. And those 4 are awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. And I'll go through those briefly as well. So awareness is the capacity of our minds to resist distraction. Think about that, to know that we're being distracted and to choose not to be distracted. So psychologists define the term meta-awareness, or knowing what the term meta-awareness as knowing what our minds are doing. And Buddhist practitioners, like in the tradition I trained in, would call this quality mindfulness, or sati, which is the actual Pali word for it, sati, which is translated as mindfulness and clear comprehension. So I want to point you back to the definition I gave you of mindfulness as this mirror-like quality of knowing what's being reflected. But this quality of mindfulness is deeper than simply seeing what's reflected and knowing what's being reflected. It's also having a clear comprehension about the implications of what is being reflected. And so it's this sati, this mindfulness combined with clear comprehension, which is necessary for real transformation to occur in us. Okay, the second is connection here, and this entails cultivating qualities that nurture harmonious interpersonal relationships. And these are qualities such as appreciation, such as kindness or compassion towards ourselves or others, feelings of goodwill and concern for others, just generally having a positive outlook. And research shows that it really doesn't take much to access and activate these latent qualities, which can flourish and become stronger when we do. Even just a few minutes a day show changes in the brain after a very short period of time. And I know that there are people in this group that are doing brain research, and I'm sure that they can validate that or confirm what I'm saying is accurate here. Next is insight into the narratives that we all have about ourselves. So there are so many people among us today, and there might even be those, there might even be a few of us on this call today whose inner narratives really reinforce negative self-beliefs, and they reinforce these beliefs about ourselves, which we then identify with and we take to be true. And these beliefs can lead into episodes of depression. So a healthy mind entails really changing our relationship to these kinds of negative narratives. And it's really not so much about changing the narrative as it is about changing our relationship to it, so we can see it for what it is. The narrative is basically a reflection of a constellation of thoughts and emotions that are arising and passing away, this constant flow that I referred to earlier. It's a process. Now, the fourth component here of the pillars of a healthy mind is purpose, or that's having a sense that our life has purpose and direction. And we can learn to recognize purpose in simple everyday activities, even in tasks as simple as brushing our teeth, which is a learned behavior, or taking out the trash. So with the findings of this study in mind, how is it that we learn to cope with the challenges associated with big and small disasters of every kind? And maybe I shouldn't use the word disasters here. I'm just trying to make it appropriate to this group of folks who are concentrating on disaster response. But the small and big challenges, the stressors of everyday life that affect the way that we meet real disasters. So in order to develop self-acceptance and equanimity as a response to the things that trigger and challenge us, like the social isolation and the ongoing nature of this COVID-19 pandemic that's just wearing on people, we have to know and have a clear sense of where we are in this very moment. And this requires that we cultivate a quality of mindfulness needed to know and see what's actually happening in our experience, and also what resources we have available to us that we can draw on in any given moment. So this requires a stable mind, a quality of stability and clarity, a presence of mind in order to know where we are and what's happening. And that's a lot. So you might ask, how exactly do we do this? Well, we have to start where we are without the need to be anywhere other than exactly where we are in order to learn the skill of non-judgmental mindfulness and equanimous observation. I've found through the years, as I've practiced myself and as I've taught other people and worked with other people, that people have a tendency to want to sort of get to the prize as quickly as possible. They want instant gratification, and and what they need to see and learn and appreciate is literally right in front of them, right in front of me, I found. And because I was thinking it was someplace else, I wasn't seeing it right in front of me. So when I say it's a lot, it is, because we have to overcome these habits and these misunderstandings about how we get from here to there. So in order to learn the skill of non-judgmental mindfulness and equanimous observation, we have to pause enough to actually be where we are. And as we do this, this quality of mindfulness deepens. We begin to gradually notice a growing awareness of old familiar thoughts and emotions that come up over and over again. Is there variations on the same theme or themes? Yes. So we begin to see the power and the momentum of our own mental inclinations and habits, once again here, as a dynamic and ever-changing flow of experience. When we pause, we can begin to see, I'm triggered by something and I'm responding in the same way over and over again. I'm just not realizing I'm just responding in the same way over and over again. So with mindfulness, we begin to see not only that we're responding or reacting, I should say, but that we're reacting in a certain way. So I react from the narrative that I create when I'm triggered is not the narrative that you would create when you're triggered, but the fact that we're being triggered is something that we share in common. So being able to see the power and the momentum of our own unique mental inclinations and habits as a dynamic, ever-flowing, ever-changing flow of experience is the promise of mindfulness. It's a game changer. When that happens, things begin to change. But this really does I'm not saying this is easy. This really does take getting used to, some getting used to, since we don't ordinarily recognize our thoughts or our emotions or our behaviors as a process of conditioned activities. Instead, we ordinarily identify them as who we are or who we take ourselves to be. So when I'm angry, I think I'm angry. I don't see that anger has arisen. When I'm sad, I think I am sad. I don't see that sadness has arisen. When I am anxious and responsive and just being reactive, I should say, I see that this is, or I perceive that as that's who I am. I don't see reactivity. You see, but with mindfulness, we begin to see the nature of thoughts and emotions that are constantly arising and passing away. And, and this really does begin to give us some space. So when we are faced with disasters, when we are faced with challenges, this spaciousness helps us maintain presence with ourselves. It helps us not lose ourselves and find ourselves feeling overwhelmed and on the brink of burnout or in the midst of burnout or depressed. It's not a guarantee that we're not going to suffer those things, but even when those things happen, we can see that this is what's happening. It's not who we are. So with a little bit of an investigation, we actually see what's taking place in our thinking process as mental images, perceptions, or as feelings, such as liking or disliking. Pleasure is good, pain is bad, sweet is nice, bitter is not. Or as mental activities, such as impulses and reactions. So we begin to see these things. So for example, I would ask you to just take a moment and consider your own experience and think of all of the moments of judging and strategizing and planning and speculating and proliferating and worrying and ruminating that you yourself do. I know I do these things. We all do these things. These are the kinds of activities of mind. These are the kinds of feelings that hook us and trap us and cause us to lose balance and fall out of this feeling of equanimity and presence with our own direct experience, which with mindfulness, we have the ability to know. So when we're feeling a quality like love, for instance, we know that love is being experienced. We know this at a pre-verbal level. And we have feelings then that we identify and label as love. But this knowing, it's to come into a place of recognizing this quality that knows what's actually happening and aligning ourselves right there. So it is possible to cultivate a stillness of heart that responds to the dynamic, ever-changing nature of life and is at the same time able to allow and hold all of our feelings and perceptions exactly as they are, whether our feelings are balanced or whether our feelings and perceptions are totally reactive and out of control. And we can learn to hold that in a non-reactive space. We can begin to see that we have choice. And as we practice mindfulness, going back to this idea of neuroplasticity, we see that different neural pathways are created in the brain, which promote these pro-social responses rather than being rooted in fight, flight, freeze, amygdala hijack kinds of reactions. So this is an example. This is an example of one way that we can consciously cultivate compassion. And it requires, and is also an expression of equanimity. You see, we can't stop. We can't stop the waves on the ocean, you see, but we can learn to surf. So the world is a certain way. My phone is talking to me. So, so this quality of equanimity is really important because it allows compassion to come into full fruition. Because one of the things that is characterized by compassion, or one of the main characteristics of compassion, is the ability to hold the opposites at the same time without needing to abandon any part of the reality of your situation. So let's say that you were suffering with something, you had a pain that was causing you distress. And the reality is that you do have this pain, but when the mind gets caught up in the pain, what happens is that we get seduced and pulled away, and we can be in relationship. I'm getting an awful lot of feedback. Could I ask people to mute themselves, please? Thanks. So, this quality of equanimity is necessary in order for us to be able to hold what is going on for us in any given moment, especially when what is going on is challenging us and triggering us. So when equanimity is absent, this quality of equanimity, as I'm talking about it, is absent, we can easily, so easily default to anger or despair, to irritability, to frustration. And we find that we deny or sugarcoat our habitual, confused, reactive states of mind that we just default to over and over again. But these reactive emotional states of mind can't coexist with the arising of compassion. It's simply not possible. When we're compassionate, we're not going to be reactive. We can see reactivity happening, but we aren't being reactive, you see. So it's also said that equanimity in this context retains empathy. That is, it's not indifferent. Equanimity isn't a quality of indifference. It's a quality of absolute patience, of kindness, actually. So seeing the patterns of our thoughts and behavior as they ebb and flow through our experience without being seduced or overwhelmed by them is really a worthwhile, a worthy and important skill to cultivate. And it allows us to witness this dynamic, continuous process and flow of impulses, of thoughts, of reactions, followed by new impulses. And recognize it for what it is instead of what we mistakenly take to be ourselves. I am not angry. Anger has arisen. I am not sad. Sadness has arisen. So this is one way that equanimity expresses as self-compassion, as self-acceptance. It enables us to keep our hearts open and in touch so we can apply investigation to our experience. And that is what gives us access to awareness, to connection, to insight, and to purpose. And these lead to insight and wisdom and the freedom that we experience when we're able to respond to the challenges that life throws in our path and all the triggers that we have to deal with, rather than being caught up in cycle after cycle of repetitive reactivity. When we learn to be with experience in this way, when we begin to recognize what it's like to feel present with ourselves, to feel like we're on our balance beam, like we're in our lifeboat. You see, when we know what that's like, and when we're tossed off of the beam or out of the boat, we also know what that's like. Both of those things are true. So the disaster happens when we're out of our boat and off of our beam and we're trying to recover. But we can get lost in reactivity and desperation trying to reestablish balance, or we can see what's happening and hold both of those things. And somehow we are able to come back into some sort of harmonious relationship with ourselves, and just test it out in your own experience. So in this way, we begin to learn that we can take responsibility for the causes and conditions that our mind encourages in the present. I want to be present. I want to be helpful. I want to alleviate the suffering in the world. You see, I'm motivated to do this. I see the pro-social benefits of this. I see the impact on my own sense of well-being, and recognize that that's true in others. So we can begin to take responsibility for the causes and also creating the conditions of mind that encourage these kinds of things for us. And we don't have to be sentenced to drowning in the errors of our past. In other words, we can choose to cultivate new, wholesome habits of mental clarity. And this is the fruit of mindfulness and compassion and self-compassion. And it's found in the spaciousness and the freedom and even the stillness of pausing just for a moment to recognize this quality of equanimity within ourselves. Sometimes it's right there, right in front of us, and we're so busy trying to get something, to become something, to be something, to achieve something, that we miss what's right there. We miss it. And when we're challenged by big and small disasters of every kind, or big and small challenges of every kind, to be able to access a quality of kindness and compassion for ourselves is just absolutely critical. And for those of you who are frontline workers working in medicine and essential service providers, cultivating these qualities in yourself is not only beneficial to you, but it's critical in this time of COVID, this time when literally we're all frontline workers. We all need to support one another and the worlds that we live in whatever ways we can, with mental clarity and open-heartedness. So those are some of my thoughts for this morning. And we're right almost at the hour. So I'm sorry that I I'm not really sorry. I'm glad that that I was able to share some of these ideas with you. But Sue, do we have time for some questions? You're on.
We
mute.
do. Yes, we do have time.
Okay, great. So, so we started a little bit late, so I'm hoping that we can keep you on for a while more.
Yeah, we have like 15 minutes for questions. I just want to tell you how much I loved your comment about amygdala hijack. What a wonderful phrase.
Yeah, it's very descriptive, isn't it?
Robert, thank you. And I think, why don't we just open it up for questions and use the time that we have that way? Any of you that like to comment or ask a question, please do. Just raise your hand and unmute your, can people unmute
Yes.
themselves? I think I see Karan.
I would like to ask a question. If
So
I'm allowed to ask a question.
could I suggest that everybody mute themselves except for the person speaking and me? Otherwise, we're going to get a lot of feedback. And then when you're done asking your question, if you could remute yourself, that seems to help.
If I'm allowed, I would like to ask you a question, sir.
Okay.
Okay, I'm Sagar Bhattacharya. That's my wife sitting with me. And I'm actually a teacher. I'm teaching in a school, foreign language, French and English. I do feel that I have been denied of social living as far as my living is confined only to my room. Okay, that brings me sometimes, it becomes very challenging. And sometimes I do feel depressed. But as you said, then we must look at it more compassionately. So we need to meditate. Meditation may be one of the means, right? So I listen to music so that I can forget the harsh reality of life, because COVID-19 has basically become a very harsh reality and threatening our lives. So is there a way to console ourselves so that we can, live in a better way?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand is there a way to control?
Is there a better way of living so that we can cope up with this disaster?
With the disaster of
Yes,
COVID-19.
with this kind of disaster where, reality seems to be very harsh, because teaching is very social. When I see my students, meet them, but now at the present moment, I seem to be slightly depressed. So is there a way out for teachers, who are doing some kind of, working from home?
Yes. Well, I'm a teacher and I work at home too. So I totally relate to what you're saying. And I've also been more or less sequestered since last March when Stanford closed down the School of Medicine and we couldn't teach our classes any longer. So your question is a very legitimate question. It's also embedded with this wish that there's a quick answer, which is completely normal. See, the answer, the honest answer that I'm going to give you is that there isn't a quick fix. I don't have a quick fix, because I also find myself going through periods where I'm in a funk, so to speak. So, so the ability to see that I'm in a funk rather than to be consumed by the funk of it allows me to change my relationship to this period of maybe low-level depression. You see, rather than getting seduced by the depression, I recognize, I'm just not feeling well today. See, so if I can recognize that that's happening before I get hooked by it and drawn into it and identified with it, I can begin to do simple self-care, self-compassionate things. I can look for ways to take care of myself, maybe take a nap or go for a walk or do some simple things, the kinds of really wonderful things that are suggested in the book that you've all participated in. These things are critically important. And the thing is that we forget to do them for ourselves. So with mindfulness, when we, in the situation you are talking about, or the question that you asked, when we can see that this is what's happening, you see, we can choose then to not take it on as an identity, but also not to deny it. We are we've fallen off of our balance beam and it's not comfortable. We want to get back on our balance beam and we want to get back there as fast as possible. And we want to go from here to there, boom. We don't want to do the steps involved. Nobody does. This is something that we share as human beings. So kindness and self-compassion is called for in this moment. And if you can begin to offer that to yourself, you can begin to recognize when your students are having difficulty. The social isolation that young people are experiencing, doing remote learning and not having the normal social interaction, is leading to tremendously negative psychological, it's having tremendously negative psychological impacts on so many kids. So thank you for your question.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Robert, I have a question about maybe the lineage that you worked with.
Mm-hmm.
Some basic questions. So you speak of anger arising.
Mm-hmm.
You also speak of sadness arising.
Mm-hmm.
And that differentiation between this being in the moment and an arising quality of emotion.
Right.
And then at another point, you spoke about love is being experienced at a pre-verbal level and a knowing recognition of love. So is loving and anger and sadness, are those qualitatively different, or is loving also arising?
That's a very interesting question. So in the moment of recognition, we might be able to say it's arising. But I think when we investigate, certainly in meditation, we might experience that love is always there. You see, compassion is always there. Loving kindness is always there. Goodwill for and happiness for the good fortune of other people. It's always there. These qualities are always there. We simply cultivate skillful means that promote conditions in which those qualities can arise, can be known. So we cultivate access to those qualities. You see, as I've done this compassion work, I realize that I'm not making myself be compassionate. I can't. I have students say, "Oh, if I could only be more compassionate, then you can't make yourself be compassionate. You can simply learn the causes and conditions in which compassion can show itself, can arise." So when one of my monastic teachers described it really beautifully, compassion is a quality of love. And he says, when love encounters suffering directly, when you see suffering directly without trying to get away from it or react to it, in any way, when you just see it and acknowledge suffering directly, when you see a disaster, what happens is your heart naturally opens. All of you people are compassion junkies. You literally have done all this work because of the movement and the connection that you have with your heart to help others to respond in this way. Now, many things are involved in it, but we don't make love arise. Love doesn't arise like anger, so to speak. Love is. Anger comes and anger goes. Love is. But in the moment of recognizing a moment of love, it can seem like it's arising. I don't know, your question was very nuanced. I had to think about this. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, well, a tiny bit of context. I work with developmental trauma a lot. People who have grown up in very traumatizing, disastrous, often situations, have the experience of love that ultimately leads to intractable conflicts. Now, this may be different kinds of what we may call love. And I know that is, that's my place where it is true, where I think it is true and I experience it as true. But that's where my question comes from. So what is it ultimately that you call love, right? Is it anything to do with what culturally or in our other conversations we call love, or is it something that is like air or like whatever? It's just something else.
So yes, okay. So what you've just demonstrated is what meditators encounter all the time. How do you describe a quality that's known directly that we're going to label love? You see, we're not talking about romantic love. We're not talking about the kind of love that if I do something for you, you're going to do something for me. This contractual kinds of things. We're talking about something that's completely without bounds and completely I can't shut my phone off. Siri is trying to answer me on my telephone. I'm sorry. So the kind of pre-verbal knowing that happens also happens with the arising of emotions like anger or sadness or happiness even. That's also true. You see, I just use love as an example because most people can relate to the sense of knowing, that that comes before we actually put words to it. Now, since your question was so nuanced, I'm going to give you a little bit more of a nuanced answer, and that is that the quality of knowing that I'm talking about, the awareness that I'm talking about, whether the awareness knows something that's afflicted or unafflicted, whether this awareness is registering like physical distress or mental distress, or whether it's reflect or aware of ease, physical or mental ease. The knowing itself is not disturbed or affected by whether it's negative or positive. You see, and that quality of knowing is what we might call awareness. And we all touch that, whether we're conscious of it or not, day in and day out. And learning to train the mind, to stabilize the mind through meditation and contemplative practices like these begins to give us access to this in a more conscious way. Thank you for your question.
I have a question.
Please.
Yeah, I'm wondering. This makes so much sense. I'm very new to mindfulness with that name actually, because a lot of things that in therapy we do is related to what you described. But I'm wondering, since when is a good moment to start teaching young people, but like very young people, to use these pillars of life, these things you've described? Is there a need of a sense of maturity, a level of maturity to start practicing mindfulness? That's actually my question.
Yeah. Actually, I would have answered that differently, a few years ago, but I am going to say, no, it's never too young to start practicing mindfulness. But with children, it's not so much of a practice as it is a way of being. It can be incorporated into their play. It can be as a parent, when you take the time to actually connect with them so they feel seen, so they feel listened to, so they feel safe in that way, they're beginning to learn what those things feel like, what those experiences are like. And in that way, they're learning, you're teaching them how to be mindful of what's happening. So if they're distressed, if they fall down and skin their knee and they're crying or something, and you meet them with your full presence and your concern, and they really feel safe and held by it, rather than being brushed off and lost and trying to figure out how they're going to regain their equanimity or their own sense of balance. You see, you're teaching them mindfulness. You're teaching them how to recognize that, they're really okay, even though their knee hurts. It's going to be okay somehow or another. And that message goes through, and then children just learn it. It's how do they learn a language? I'm trying to teach myself French, and it's like, oh my God, it's not such an easy task. But if I had learned as a child, I would have learned without even knowing I was learning. You see, so this is my big bucket list item. I'm going to learn French before I die. Damien, did that help?
Yes, a lot. It did help a lot. Yeah, it's related to some other concept I practice with my children, and what I learn in therapy, which is no matter how hard the thing that happened to your child, could be like physical or some rejection, socially speaking. Yeah. It's the important thing is someone to rescue them, to be there to rescue them, for them to feel your presence. So it's related to that. So thank you. Yeah, it did very much.
Good. So, in the talk, I mentioned how we can learn to cultivate this quality in simple everyday tasks, even as simple as brushing our teeth or taking out the trash. It's just a matter of paying attention to what you're doing when you're doing it, to what's happening when it's happening, to knowing where you are and what's right in front of you and attending to that. Boom. Now there's this, now there's this, now there's this. And it sounds very simple, but it's not easy to do. We just have to really be committed, and we have to keep watching what we're doing. And we have to know that we're going to screw up 10,000 times or more. And this is just part of the path. This is part of the unfolding. See, so every day presents us with opportunities and challenges. Every day presents us with little disasters and big disasters. You see, and the way that we learn to consciously cultivate these skills is we learn to identify what these things are and how they're used. That's the clear comprehension part of mindfulness. We see what's happening, but we also see the implications of what's happening and how that affects our life. If we do this, it's going to go that way. And if we do the other, it's going to go in a different direction. So be with what's right in front of you.
You're muted, Sue.
I was saying thank you, Robert, and thank you to everyone with your presence and your questions. And we do need to close because we try very hard to respect everyone's time. And I just want to thank you for this valuable time, Robert. And if anybody else wants to come off and just say a brief goodbye or a brief anything, otherwise, I think we do need to just acknowledge and say thank you for this wonderful hour that we had.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was
Remember your words
wonderful.
today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.
Paul.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
That was Nellie. Yeah.
Yes, that was.
Merci beaucoup, Robert.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Sue.
Bye,
Don.
Dana.
Thank you for
So
staying
nice
up so
to
late.
see you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Robert. C'est un performance magnifique.
Thank you, Robert.
Hey, so nice to see you again.
Yeah, I have been missing you
Yes,
and our whole group. But
likewise. I'm going to do a reunion. pretty
oh,
soon.
great. Yeah.
Yeah. Good.
Mhm.
Thank you very much.
You're